to bring China-U.S. relations back to the track of healthy and stable growth to the benefit of our two countries and the world as a whole.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. We will continue to follow the summit meeting. Many thanks to our guests, and thank
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello, welcome to Dialogue. Chinese President Xi Jinping meets with the U.S. President Joe Biden on the sidelines of this year's G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, and is calling for his U.S. counterpart to join hands to chart the right course for the China-U.S. relationship, as the world expects the two countries to properly handle their relationship. He said that they need to work with all countries to bring more hope to world peace, greater confidence to global stability, and strong impetus to common development. President Biden said that the two countries have the responsibility to show the world they can manage differences and prevent competition from becoming anything even near conflict. This is the first face-to-face meeting between two leaders since Joe Biden became U.S. president. What are the expectations for the high-level meeting? In what way may it impact the direction of the world's most important bilateral ties? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Anna Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, Dr. Zhao Hai, research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Professor Joe Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. President Xi and President Biden met on Monday ahead of the G20 summit, actually, which is the first face-to-face meeting, as we said, after Joe Biden took office as U.S. president in January 2021. So, Zhao Hai, we'll start with you. How significant is the meeting?
I think this is a very significant meeting after 3 years that the two leaders of the two great countries are not able to meet face-to-face. And that's why in the very beginning, the opening remarks both said that face-to-face talk are very important for both countries. And in particular, during the Bali meeting, that this particular meeting bilaterally happened ahead of the General Conference, and also it's the first thing the two leaders did right after they landed in the city. So I think that shows how important this bilateral relationship to each other and how serious they see this bilateral relationship moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, in their opening remarks before bilateral talks, both leaders mentioned, one way or the other, that there's a responsibility on their shoulders to well manage the relationship for the sake of world peace and stability. So can we say this is a very positive signal?
It is an almost obvious sort of lip service, I would say, due to the fact that we know that we are going through an unusual, tense, and dangerous period. The world is going through a major crisis. I don't want to go into superlatives and say the world globally hasn't gone through such a crisis of such gravity since 20 years, 40 years, 80 years, but this is a very serious crisis. And we're speaking about the two leaders of the most powerful players on earth meeting. We know that on the bilateral level between China and the U.S., there are problems. and there are actually more and more problems over the recent period. So, yeah, so the right thing to do, I would say, the rational thing to do would actually start with sort of opening remarks which would be mild, which would be, if not optimistic, at least realistic in the good sense. Let's wait 24 hours or so and see what kind of more detailed impressions we may have of the meeting of these two major leaders of planet Earth.
Well, Anna, President Xi said that he was ready to have candid and in-depth exchanges of views with Biden on issues of strategic importance to their ties as well as global issues. So what do you expect are the priorities, probably for the two leaders?
Well, based on the statements that have been made by the State Department and the White House, it's all about drawing red lines, making sure that there's a bottom to, preventing conflict. I mean, it's not very hopeful. They're there. The G20 was there to create and address massive global issues. The financial crisis, the last one, started by the U.S. And instead of talking about these issues, long-term global warming, short-term, this economic situation and the pandemic, he's talking about, how he wants to manage conflict with China. This harkens back to what happened with Japan and the United States back in the 70s. The U.S. was unhappy that Japan was doing well, and they forced it to sign the Plaza Accord. And I think that's very telling. You see, literally, them operating out of the same playbook this time around.
So that's about the nature of this relationship. Do you mean like the U.S. somehow finds the new China, a rising China, as a challenge probably to its preeminence?
Well, we've talked about this many times. I mean, people who believe in American exceptionalism, this idea that the U.S. must be in control of the world in order to exert a one style of government, is necessary. China's rise and success over 40 years is an existential threat to these people. They see it as China could not possibly be doing as well as it is unless it's cheated or done something wrong. They can't produce any evidence. They say the same things over and over again, but they don't actually present anything that would convince anybody. But repetition is there, and I would expect more of the same. This is not going to be productive, in my opinion.
Right. Well, Joe Hai, President Xi said that he talked about bringing a healthy and a stable China-U.S. relationship back on track. But if you take a look at the U.S. side, in particular, in the time running up to the summit, they talked about the red lines, they talked about the fierce competition. Seems the expectations are quite different from the two sides.
Exactly. If you listen to President Biden and his team, they're talking about managing differences. From a year ago, President Biden started talking about erect guardrails for the bilateral relationship. And also, they've been talking about how to avoid conflict, crisis, and all kinds of these rhetoric. They are trying to paint U.S.-China relationship in a crisis mode. And, the only thing that should happen between the two countries is to manage to avoid the worst case scenario. However, if you listen to President Xi, this is very different. It sounds very different because China is telling the U.S. that the bilateral relationship is on the wrong track and it should be built on peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation. And China is hopeful, and China said that the world expect that both sides could come together and work together. And President Biden only talked about climate change, for instance, as an area for mutual cooperation. However, from China's perspective, there's a wide variety of issues that the two sides can work together. So again, I think this meeting is important, critical, because at this crossroad, as President Xi stated, that the U.S. need to make a political decision whether or not they can trust and work with China on top global challenges, or they just wanted to say something about cooperation, but actually focus very much on this kind of competition that is not healthy and leading to the wrong track down the road and making this bilateral relationship even less trustworthy.
Professor Toker, obviously, in the Chinese side, at least if you talk to the academics, they would say, when President Biden promised to President Xi Jinping, during previous 5 rounds of phone and video talks, about stabilizing the relationship. But then, if you take a look at what the U.S. did to China, for example, sweeping ban on exports to China and preferring its allies not to export these products to China, it looks more like something more than competition sometimes, or fierce competition even.
Yes, I agree that there is a competition plus, let's say, because the language President Biden in American diplomacy uses is that America and the West, perhaps in a larger sense, would like to see competition between the West, the U.S. and China, but would not like to see conflict. I think that this is sincere. We have to add, for a better comprehension of the context of such a positioning, the fact that indeed there is some kind of new consciousness in the West, and mainly in America, but not only in America. It's true in Europe, it's true in Australia, it's true in Asia, some places, that there are some symptoms and some manifestations of more assertive Chinese foreign policy, military manifestations, and perhaps ambitions on the mind of the Chinese state. That could be wrong or right in comparison to previous periods in the past, in which at least it wasn't spelled out this way by Western leaders. But this is the situation, let's say, over the last at least 2, if not 4 years. And I think that this is what we find right now in the vocabulary, in the terminology used by President Biden as he walks into this very important, obviously, summit meeting with President Xi.
Mm-hmm. Anna, you are shaking your hands. So remember, Professor Toker talked about, probably 4 years, since the last 4 years, or probably since they said Donald Trump took office, much earlier. The trade war started by the U.S., not by the Chinese side, right?
Well, it goes back to the pivot to Asia. I mean, that was Obama, so it predates Trump. And it was this idea that Asia was becoming too economically strong and that the U.S. needed to take an interest. That morphed from Obama's let's, pay more attention to Asia to let's put our foot down on the neck of China under Trump. I mean, remember, he was going to solve the export balance payments. Trade balance. Yeah. Well, it's higher today than it ever was, and it was higher when he left office than when he began. But there's really no strategy here. What you have is just the U.S. saying we need to be in charge. They're bullying other countries and saying it. But what I don't understand is why Biden continues on this. It didn't work. I mean, right now, the United States is the one who lost 185-2 because they were sanctioning Cuba. They're the ones who were not able to rally the entire world against Russia. In fact, the global South and the stands want no part of this European war. So why he keeps saying that he's somehow leading the world. What it seems, if you start looking at a map and start looking at where countries actually are, he's isolating not only the U.S., but also Europe and Australia, and in some cases, parts of Asia.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, if we talk about competition, and then the question is competition for what? I mean, China is not looking to become the #1 country or competing the United States to become the most dominant country in the world. China, there's 1.4 billion people need to be taken care of by the Chinese government. That's a lot of a challenge for the Chinese government, instead of looking at the entire world.
Yeah, I hear and I understand this way of presenting the overall large dimension of long-term ambitions. But this is not the way the reading of this perspective is being operated by Western leaders, by the great majority of Western leaders, let them be Americans or German or French or British or Australian or Japanese. Those rather decode what China is doing and what they see on the terrain. Let it be in the South China Sea. Let it be in other hot spots or potentially hot spots in Eastern Asia. Let it be in Africa. Let it be in Latin America. Let it be even what some interpretations are of the huge Chinese investment efforts all over the world, right?
But Professor
True enough,
Toker,
China
Professor Toker, I'm sorry to stop you here. What's wrong with a huge investment, for example, in Africa or in Latin America by the Chinese side?
Nothing is wrong per se. It's the contextualization of what is happening beyond what the way economy talks and trade expresses itself. Now, this is why I started answering the question by pointing at the interpretational level of the West as it looks at China. The West may be wrong, the West may be exaggerating, the West may be confused, the West may be even inventing, if you wish, arguments which are more comfortable for its proper ambitions and interests. But you cannot say that you look at the world, you look at who's active where, you see in who's present right now in different parts of the world in comparison to the situation 10 and 20 years ago, you cannot avoid such a diagnosis. Now, it can be right or wrong, or it can be more severe or less severe, but it is there. The ingredients are there.
A response?
Well, I don't know. You could say it could be this or that. I don't really understand that argument. The fact is, the West is growing increasingly irrelevant. Where it should be taking up the gauntlet in terms of the current economic crisis, it's doing nothing. Where it should be tackling climate change, it says basically it refuses. You had Boris Johnson come out and say, well, yeah, we polluted our way to success, but tough. We're not going to pay. All right? And you have similar ideas across the wealthy, former colonial powers, including France, who just say, well, we just don't have enough to spare to make sure that the world is all right. We should get these developing countries who have nothing, who have only debts, have problems because Europe is sucking up all of the gas out there. I mean, natural gas. And what I mean by that is right now in the markets, these companies are breaking their contracts and paying the penalty clause so that they can export their gas to Europe for a profit above everything that they have to pay in penalties. I mean, where's the concern about this? Where is the fairness? So, politically, this idea that it could be this or that and the West sees it this way, it's nonsense. The realities are here, and there is no one who is responding to it from the West.
Well, Zhao, obviously, there are differences, there are different perceptions, sometimes misperception probably, in particular with the rapid development of China. I think to a certain degree, I understand the concern, China is becoming more influential, more powerful. What will China do to the rest of the world? Whether China will become a benign force or even threatening. The thing is, if you look, objective look at China, China has its own challenges. China is focusing on the development, and in particular, if the National Congress of the CPC just concluded. If you look at the Chinese foreign policy, how do you describe it? And many people say there's a strong consistency there.
Yeah, well, the fundamental problem is that China is very different. Its culturally different, its political system is different, its ideology is different, its modernization trajectory is different, and there are so many differences that even though we're facing common challenges, the West, in many ways, particularly the United States, refuse to recognize that there are commonalities, and actually the common ground is larger than they think. And so that's why I think face-to-face communication is so important, as President Xi has stated, that it is a good place to resolve misconceptions, misjudgment, and also to establish correct baselines on viewing each other's strategic goals. And moving forward, I think it's very important for the U.S. side to understand fundamentally that China does not pose a threat, a national security threat, particularly to the United States, in a way that's stated in their national security strategy report. And also, I think it's important by this meeting to reduce negative political agenda, because in the past couple of years, since Trump to Biden, as Einer pointed out, the U.S. Policy towards China is always very negative, and actually, its policy toward the world, strategy towards the world, is very negative. Biden administration started to realize that. However, they don't have the political gut to actually come up with more affirmative, a more positive political agenda to improve the relationship and trying to really lead the world to a better to a better future. So again, the China is actually calling on the United States to come up with more positive agenda, starting with addressing the 4 lists that China has already given to the U.S. side, correcting some of the mistakes, serious mistakes made by the Trump administration, and starting from there, repair and improve the bilateral relationship. And together, I think China and the U.S. can help to resolve many of the world's current problems, including energy and food crisis, the public health crisis, and also, in particular, climate change crisis.
Professor Toker, let's put aside the differences between the two countries and focus on what they can do jointly to help resolve the problems facing the world, like climate change, like a nuclear issue probably in the Korean Peninsula, or Iranian nuclear issue, and of course cross-border crimes, etc. So there's a lot for them to work together, right?
Yes, and I agree with the final sentence, paragraph of my colleague. Indeed, that's the brighter side of the moon, if I may say so. If indeed there would be a possibility to isolate, or at least to outline in a more effective way, the interests, the domains of cooperation of these two leading giants, which they have in common, then of course we would be in a better world. But we cannot avoid the fact that around these more positive or potentially positive domains, such as common cooperation regarding climate change and several crises around the world about which the Chinese and the Americans, or the West more generally, so speaking, do have common interests in spite of what may be apparent on the surface. So yes, this is a constructive way of looking at it, but we have to keep in mind the fact that the way about going on foreign policy and on relations between great powers are not equal in China and in the West. In the United States, in the European Union, in Australia, in Japan, there is a large-scale debate and public opinion divergences over foreign policy options to take. There are oppositions and coalitions. There are those who are in government and fighting in order to preserve electorally their hold to power. There are oppositions who believe that the government is not doing enough or doing wrong steps. All these are part of what we hear on the public scene. This is why we hear more options and a larger sphere of elements which are relevant to foreign relations, including bilateral ones between China and the U.S. This is why I was intrigued a few minutes ago in our conversation when our colleague did the comparison between America's relations and attitude towards Japan during the 70s, 50 years ago almost, and the situation today regarding the U.S.-China. I don't think this is a very exact or pertinent comparison. Japan was in the American...
There's not much differences between the Republicans and Democrats in terms of their China policy. Basically, there's one of the very few consensus between the two parties. That's be hawkish on China, be hardline on China. There's not much really constructive discussion inside of the U.S.
Yeah, you're right. I think that actually on the asset, when you look at that in a deep way, you don't find extraordinary gaps between what the Republicans and the Democrats in America think about the medium and long-range perspectives of the U.S.-China relations or the so-called real ambitions of China regarding the long term. But first of all, I would outline that in Europe, the gaps are more important regarding those who do attribute more positive or more negative intentions to China in the long run. And I would also mention the fact that in American public opinion, those elements are not very stable. And in the context of a larger situation, take the crisis right now around the war in Ukraine. We see, look at the debate in the West regarding the question, what does China really want in the Russian-Ukraine war? Look at the way there are different ways of interpretation, what the Chinese really think, so to speak, and what the Chinese really do. As we know that on the background, objectively speaking, when you look at the maps and when you look at common sense, China could play a major, if not the most single important role in the international community in order to advance peace in this tragedy in Ukraine. So you see, things are not just a function of what is being directly said about them in debates in parliaments or in party conventions.
Well, and it seems like, as John Hai pointed out, the Chinese political system, Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese practice, they are very different from Western-style democracies. That plays a quite important role probably in creating these kind of differences or gaps between China and the Western countries, including the U.S. But the thing is, the world is, diversified world. Diversity itself is nothing wrong. We should learn to respect each other and continue to do business, and continue to be friends, even we are different, right?
Not in the U.S. Right now the U.S. is being divided on so many issues, including race. And a lot of this is just scapegoating. The reason
Excuse me, we have a package about this, the opening remarks of the presidents during the summit. Let's take a look.
总统先生你好。
It's nice to meet you, Mr.
我们
President.
上次见面啊，是2017年的
We last
达沃
met
斯论坛
during the Davos
多
Forum
了。
in 2017. It's been
但
5
是你
years'
上任以来
time.
呢，我们这个通过
Ever since you assumed office, we've met each other through video conferencing
一直保持着沟通。
and the
但
calls.
是这个呢，
We have
都
always
不如
been
啊面对面
keeping
的
the communication. So it's very rare opportunity for us to have this
今天
first
我们
face-to-face
实现
communication.
了面对面的会见。
We made it today.
中美呢，从接触、建交
From the initial contact and the establishment of diplomatic relations to today,
也经历了
China
风
and the
风雨雨
U.S. have gone through 50 plus eventful
可以说
years with gains and
有得有失，
losses,
也就是有
as
经
well
验有教
as
训。
experience and lessons.
历史无论如何都是最好的教科书。
History is the best
我们
textbook.
就是以史为鉴。
We should take it as a mirror and let it guide the future.
当前呢，中美关系啊，
Currently,
面临的这种
the
局面，
state of
都
China-U.S.
是我们所关
relations
心的。
is not
因为的话呢，就是
in the
处于这
fundamental
么一个局面
interests
是不符合我们
of
两国和两国
our
人民
two
根本
countries and peoples. So we're
也不
all
符合
very
国
concerned
际社会的
with
期待。
our relationship. It's not
我们
what
两
the
个呢，作为
international
中美
community
两个大国的
expects
领导
from
人，
us either.
我们能起到一个
As leaders of two
把舵
major countries,
定向的作
we
用。
need to play the leadership role.
我们应该为两国关系发展
We should
找到正确
set
的
the
方
right
向，
course for the China-U.S.
而且要推
relationship
动中美关系啊向
and
上提升。
put it on an upward trajectory.
政治家要思考和明确的，就是本国的发展方
A
向。
statesman
但同时
should
也
think
要明
about
确
and know where to lead
思
his
考
country.
同世界
He should also
同他
think
国的相
about
处
and know how to get along with other countries and the
我
wider
们总认
world.
为当前的时代之变是前所未有的方式
We
展
believe
开
that
的
in this time and age, great changes are unfolding
也
in
面
ways
临着
like never
前所
before.
未有的挑战。
Humanity is confronted with
世界是站
unprecedented
在十字路
challenges.
口的
The world has come to a crossroad. Where to go from here? This is a question that is not just on our mind, but also on the mind of all countries. The world expects that China and the U.S. will properly handle their relationship. Our meeting today has attracted the world's attention. We should work with all countries to bring more hope to world peace, greater confidence in global stability, and stronger impetus to common development. As always, I am ready to have a candid and in-depth exchange of views with you on issues of strategic importance in China-U.S. relations and on major global and regional issues. I also look forward to working with you to bring China-U.S. relations back to the track of healthy and stable growth to the benefit of our two countries and the world as a whole.
Well, with that, we come to the end for today's show. We will continue to follow the summit meeting. Many thanks to our guests, and thank you for being with us. See you next time.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
On today's World Insight, chart the right course for China-U.S. ties, the call from Chinese President Xi Jinping as he meets face-to-face with U.S. President Joe Biden at the Bali G20 summit. What does it mean for the future of bilateral relations?
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Xu Qingduo, sitting in for Tian Wei. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called on U.S. President Joe Biden to chart the right course for China-U.S. relations in the Monday meeting on the sidelines of the Bali G20 summit. It's the first face-to-face meeting between the Chinese and the U.S. presidents since Mr. Biden took office. President Xi also asked Mr. Biden that the two countries should take history as a mirror and let it guide the future.
国际社会普遍期待中美处理好彼此的关系。
The world expects that China and the U.S. would properly handle their relationship. Our meeting today has attracted the world's highest attention. We should work with all countries to bring more hope to world peace, greater confidence in global stability, and stronger impetus to common development. As always, I am ready to have a candid and in-depth exchange of views with you on issues of strategic importance in China-U.S. relations, global and regional issues. I also look forward to working with you to bring U.S.-China relations back to the track of healthy and stable growth to the benefit of our two countries and the world as a whole.
推动中美关系重回健康稳定发展的轨道，造福两国，惠及世界。
We share responsibility, in my view, to show that China and the United States can manage our differences, prevent competition from becoming anything ever near conflict, and to find ways to work together on urgent global issues that require our mutual cooperation. So, President Xi, I look forward to our continuing and ongoing open and honest dialogue we've always had, and I thank you for the opportunity.
What's the significance of the meeting on the prospects of China-U.S. relations? Let's loop in our panelists. In Beijing, Rong Ying, Vice President of China Institute of International Studies, Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies Program, National Institute for Global Strategy, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Anna Tangen, Political and Economic Affairs Commentator. Welcome to the show. Well, during the face-to-face meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Indonesia, The talks between the two presidents went on for nearly 3 hours. Rongying, I will start with you. So what do you make of this first face-to-face meeting since basically 2021 in January?
Well, certainly this is a very important meeting for the relationship of China and the United States, and I think also for the history of China-U.S. relationship. The atmosphere is very much, I think, in a way relaxed, in a way, I would say. And also in diplomatic jargon, the meeting was conducted in in-depth, candid, and constructive. And if you look at the sort of press release out of the meetings, from the Chinese viewpoint, I think this is a quite positive and meeting in a way that would be followed through with more and more interactions and even concrete steps to stabilize the relationship and for a healthy relationship for the days or even years ahead. Having said that, I think differences remains, challenges are there. The most important thing is that these agreements, these consensus should be followed through. But more importantly, I think the United States should work hard to meet the Chinese side halfway, so that the relationship would be bring back to the right track for stability, for stable and healthy development.
Zhao Hai, what's your takeaway?
Well, I basically agree with Mr. Rongying's analysis and evaluation of this very important, critical meeting between the two top leaders. One thing is very important. Out of this meeting, the atmosphere between these two countries are now changing. Even though it's gradual, it's just a small step towards a bigger goal. However, that's a good start. And from the press release, of course, we all read these two and compare these two. The differences, of course, remain. However, they agree to establish joint working groups to work on those difficult issues. And also, they restarted the cooperation on many of the global challenges, including public health, including climate change and food and energy security. So these are all good signs that the two sides wanted to maintain a healthy and stable relationship, despite the fierce competition that the U.S. side continued to press. However, Chinese side also laid down the basics of our strategic goals to the U.S. That is, China does not seek to overthrow the United States and does not want to change the current international order. So there are many things laying ahead for both sides working on, but this is a very good sign that in the future, these two top leaders will continue to talk to each other and will maintain an open line of communication, and that's good for both countries.
Well, Anna, President Xi mentioned that we need to play the leadership role, set the right course for the China-U.S. relationship, and put it on an upward trajectory. What does the right course mean, do you think, in the president's statement here?
Well, I mean, the right course is an acceptance by the United States that, different countries have different, legal systems, political systems, social systems, ideologies, etc. I mean, the U.S. couldn't be any more different from Saudi Arabia than it is from many other countries. This idea that somehow all countries have to conform to this kind of end of the world last man standing of Francis Fukuyama, that there should be only one type of government and economic system, hasn't worked in the past and it won't work in the future. So at this juncture, I mean, Xi Jinping is trying to be the adult in the room and saying, look, people are looking at us as the two big countries here. We need to work together. The United States, though, if you take a look at their readout, it was all about, you have to stop being so aggressive towards Taiwan. I think it's the U.S. that's sailing warships up and down the Taiwan Straits. Talk about Xinjiang, intellectual property, Hong Kong, Tibet, all of these things. These are all tired talk points, which you hear on a routine basis, put out by the State Department. But, there's no substance, just repetition.
Just most of the time rhetoric. Rong Yin, as Anna pointed out, the U.S. side, of course, highlighted some of the differences. Mostly Chinese domestic affairs is really none of the U.S. business in the sense. But anyway, that's the U.S. So you mentioned about implementation. Why implementation is so important? Previously, President Biden talked about basically the 5 no's. No intention for regime change in China, change Chinese political system, or to launch a new Cold War against China. No intention to be allied with other countries against China, etc. Or no intention to support independence of Taiwan. But do you think the U.S. has, in the past at least, has followed through on those promises?
That's a big question, Mark. I think these 5 no's certainly are very important from the Chinese perspective. And this is also, I think, the political statement, pledges made by the United States, by the American side, by President Biden himself. Unfortunately, at least from what we have seen over the past years, they have not been followed through by the American side. That is raise a big question, the seriousness, the sincerity of these pledges, and that could become very problematic. And I would also echo, I think, Atkins' viewpoint that if you look at the readouts of the United States side, it's quite heavily sort of a negative part in a way that because it touched upon a lot of issues from the Chinese, which Chinese side would strongly view that, and the issues of internal affairs that they don't want the United States to interfere. That is exactly, I think, China has been calling for. A kind of a relationship should be guided by mutual respect, recognizing there are differences between China and the United States. And these differences have been there for many years before, and it will be there for many years and in the future. The point is that China and the United States have different systems. Does not mean they could not coexist in peace. The important thing is that China and the United States should work together, and particularly the United States, as I think the 2 presidents agreed, to work out principles to guide, to pursue a right way to get along in a way that these differences will not be in a way undermine the healthy, stable relationship. That is, I think, the issue. That is the challenge facing the relationship, even though we try our best to be optimistic.
Well, Zhao Hai, President Xi said that currently the state of China-U.S. relations is not in the fundamental interests of the 2 countries and the peoples. It is not what the international community expects from us either. Obviously, that use one word, probably that's not satisfactory. From the U.S. perspective, they would point a finger at China. But from Chinese perspective, if you look at the U.S. strategy on China, that's quite different from previous practice. For example, in the past decade, the U.S. Basically chose to engage with China, so-called engagement with China. But at least since Donald Trump, they talked about basically confrontation or a competition, and now with probably not that much cooperation with China. So that is also the problem probably to shape the relationship here.
Yeah, I think there are many problems, many issues between the 2 countries. And during the time of engagement, these issues have been talked about, discussed, and trying to find solutions. However, what happened is that President Trump came into office and completely abandoned the engagement. And the Biden administration actually followed up on the Trump administration's China policy. And that's the problem fundamentally, because they initiated this change and continue down the path of so-called fierce competition. However, the guardrails that already existed, like we've proposed, our position is that the 3 communiques are the guardrails for the China-U.S. relationship. However, the U.S. now wanted to establish something new. And in a way, on particularly China's internal affairs issues, particularly Taiwan, the U.S. is not on practice following these communiques and trying to hollow up the one China policy. So in a way that, if we wanted to repair this relationship and improve it, both sides needs to take responsibility, and the U.S. side at this point needs to take initiative to change the current status of the relationship. And it should start with, correcting the mistake and the, unreasonable policies implemented during the Trump administration. China has called on the U.S. to have the political courage to change that for a very long time, and so far the Biden administration does not show any inch of responsibility to change that. So even though on rhetoric, the U.S. side saying 5 no's, but in reality, we're still waiting for the U.S. to take responsibility and make progress on this most important bilateral relationship. So no, we're not satisfied with the current progress on U.S.-China relations. However, after this meeting, I remain cautiously optimistic that gradually, with the opening of people-to-people exchanges and many more communication lines, we can reestablish some level of trust and make this relationship recover just as the COVID pandemic disappears.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Joe, a follow-up here. A question, from the Chinese side, you can see the Chinese side has stressed very much about bringing back the relationship on the right track of healthy and stable growth. But for the U.S. side, in particular, in the time running up to the summit, people talked about red lines. People talked about the bottom line, fierce competition. It seems like the expectation from the two sides are quite different. But can we say that after the meeting, somehow they could work together and probably to build more trust? Starting some confidence in each other.
Yeah, both sides came into this meeting have two, I think, different level of expectations or different kind of goals. Because as President said during the meeting, that if the U.S. look carefully about China's 20th Party Congress report, it should understand and make no mistake of understanding China's strategic intentions. And the U.S. side continued to insist on this very distorted vision of China and understanding of China's strategic goals, and continue to try to believe that China is somehow trying to interfere into U.S. domestic politics, overthrow U.S. as a global dominant power, changing completely the international order, and somehow install or spread China's ideology and political system around the world. And with these wrongful ideas about China, how can you expect a good sort of relationship coming out of the two countries? Mm-hmm. So we need to go to the root and from the start correcting those mistakes and trying to, having some goodwill between the two countries and between the two peoples in particular to start to recover this relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, if you look at the Biden government's China policy, some would say basically he's doubled down on the Trump policy on China, like a sweeping ban on the tech products export to China, and also pressuring allies to join the U.S. against China. And then, even economists, which is not pro-China, said that, one piece, it cited academics and business community people in the U.S. saying that Biden has gone too far on China. What do you make of that?
Well, he has. Today in the world, the biggest problem is trust. And you cannot have trust with somebody who's not reliable. The U.S. has proven itself unreliable, whether it's Kyoto or the Paris Climate Accord or the Iranian nuclear deal. And now it comes to these 3 communiques. So you just don't know from administration to administration what they're going to do. Maybe not Donald Trump, but somebody else will be the next president at some point. And things can change in a moment. So this idea that there's continuity has been destroyed, especially when, Trump just, he walked out on everything. They had the big economic pact, the TPP, that the U.S. wanted to push, that had special considerations for the U.S. It would have been in its favor. He walked away from it. So, there's no continuity anymore. So, and I do agree you have to go back to basics, and the U.S. has to commit itself to saying, look, every administration is going to be different, but American policy should follow along a certain line. And right now, all we see is a repeat of what happened with Japan. Back in the 70s, when Japan was seen as an existential threat to the United States, there was hysteria about it. Everything that was saying bad about China was then being said bad about Japan. And what did they do? They forced Japan to sign the Plaza Accord. And since that time, Japan literally has gone backwards. Today, Japan's economy is less than it was in 1986. So, you know, these are things which China watches, and they're certainly not going to throw up their arms and say, okay, we capitulate, we will be your vassal state, we will subject ourselves to economic second-class citizen, a kind of economic apartheid, because you want to be on top.
But clearly, China is not Japan. Well, Rong-Ying, you know, if you look at the Chinese foreign policy, for example, toward the United States, which is stable and consistent, I think that's a contrast to what Anna has mentioned about the lack of consistency in the U.S. policy, in a sense, toward China. For example, you know, Trump policy very different, giving up the engagement. But if you look at the relationship, which is important to both sides, but also to the rest of the world. They are the two largest economies and the two most powerful countries in the world, arguably. So yes, there's indeed imperative for the two countries to work together. But do you think the U.S. side, you know, has realized that there's a responsibility too on their shoulder to work with China to make sure there will be a stable, at least, stable and workable relationship between the two sides?
Well, certainly I think the United States does want China to play a role that would help share the so-called burden of the United States. But I think at least there are many analysts, both Chinese and Americans and others, international ones, believe that they does not want China to or they are very much afraid of China would be replacing or taking over the role or the position of the United States, being the dominant or the number one, the world leader positions like that. So that is a kind of a contradiction I think the United States is facing. And China, as you rightly said, has been consistent and transparent in a way that China strongly feels, increasingly feels that its growth, at its rises, it will take more responsibilities. And being the first and second largest economy, it is imperative, it is a kind of responsibility, China and the United States, to shoulder and to work by working together to find a way to address the global challenges, the regional challenges for that. But within that process, I think the changes or the complications comes from the United States. The United States no longer has the confidence or have the, I think, the vision that by working with China, they would be able to continue to play a role that would help the world at large to address these challenges. This is something I think the problem, the root cause of the problem are like that. That's why I think we increasingly over the past few years, we've seen the talk about the failure of engagement of the United States towards China and the need to have a different sort of a strategy to outcompete China. I think China is not afraid of competition. If it is going to be healthy, if it is a kind of competition based on sort of rules that would be acceptable to the two sides. But China, I don't think it would be accept a kind of a rule that would be only made by the United States. That is not the fair way for competition.
Maybe there's a need of a change, probably, of the attitudes from Washington that you have to accept a developing China, which continues to rise. but with no intention to really to compete or replace the U.S. But turning to the importance of working together, Zhou Hai, I think because it's the sideline of G20 summit, for people who has good memories, like 2008 and 2009, the global financial crisis, China and the U.S., they joined hands and basically saved the world. And now people are looking at the two countries working together, not only saving the world, or economic recovery and probably preventing a global recession, but also, to deal with other challenges, the climate change and also cross-border crimes, health crisis in the future, etc. There's a genuine need for the two countries to work together.
Yes, indeed. Remember, G20 started before the 2008 crisis, and after that crisis, it sort of breathed a new life because now you have a platform to gather all the important, big economies in the world to work together to try to recover the economy. And after that, I think G20 platform has persistently been a good platform for countries, top leaders together and to discuss important international economic issues. And today, it become a very key mechanism to help us work together, working on global challenges. And we've been seeing the gradual deterioration of global governance in recent years. There's a lot of deficit between the demand, the need of developing countries in the world, and there's a lack of offers or provision from the developed countries. So in order to bring the two parties together, it's very important to sustain the G20 because G7 alone cannot solve the world's problems. It's not inclusive enough. It's very much a exclusive club for the rich. So moving forward, I think these bilateral meeting of China and the U.S. is a good start for this year's G20, and hopefully it can breathe new life and it can sustain the cooperation that happened along the way in the past 10, 15 years and continue to provide G20 a viable platform for all the countries to work on jointly, working on those very difficult issues like particularly this year with the pandemic, with the war, with the instability around the world, with the geopolitical competition. At this particular moment, the world needs leadership, and the U.S. alone is not providing that, even though Biden administration claimed that they're trying to provide that because they need to have a broader base. And China is part of that, and they need more developing countries on board. I think now, again, this is a good start, but we still have a long way to go, and we need to see what's going to happen in the coming days in G20 and then after that, APEC.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a good point. I think the countries should come together and work together, develop the world, and also the emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, because G7 alone is not able to solve the world's problems.
No, absolutely. I mean, the G20 was created for the one particular crisis, and the world is looking to it again to do that. But what did you have? This whole effort that was done by Indonesia was supposed to talk about technology, about the pandemic, about the economic situation, the debt crisis, etc. Climate change, no, it's been hijacked. The Europeans and America want to talk about Ukraine, which is not part of the G20. And they also want to talk about China and the relationship there. I mean, we have so many pressing economic and real ecological problems. It's just really hard to see why it's appropriate for the U.S. to come in and try to lecture other countries about issues that are internal. While meanwhile, the U.S. is exporting inflation and doesn't seem to really care about the rest of the world. I mean, every time the Fed increases the rates, it is driving the rest of the world into the poverty bin. They can't pay their debts. They don't have working economies, and inflation goes up.
Right. Well, briefly, just one sentence. I will start with you, Rongying. So, what's your comment on the Biden meeting, the first face-to-face meeting since Biden took office?
Well, certainly it's a great meeting. It's a meeting that promises a bright future and a stable relationship for the China-U.S. relationship if the agreements and consensus is being implemented and followed through with sincerity.
Implementation. Zhao Hai?
I think this meeting put a floor on the China-U.S. relationship, and hopefully it won't drop further, and starting from here to recover from a better relationship and for the better world.
Anna?
Long journey starts with one step. This is a very small step, but at least it's going forward.
Well, and that's all we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Xu Qinduo on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us, and bye for now.